There are many reasons why people move. Some voluntarily choose to leave their homelands in order to find a better place, a better way of life. Others are forced to abandon their homes due to drought, flooding, or deforestation. A large number of immigrants, however, leave because of political conflict, religious persecution, or a combination of both. These folks are usually designated as refugees who have been forced to leave their country due to violent conflict. Refugees normally want to return to their homeland once the war is over. However, these situations often lead to years of displacement. Many seek asylum elsewhere because they simply have no recourse whatsoever to return home. Take, for example, the story of George, his wife Annie, and their twins. They once had a prosperous lifestyle in the Syrian city of Aleppo, but because of the war in Syria, they were forced to flee to Armenia. Starting a new life in a foreign country was quite tough. They tried as hard as they could to make ends meet in their new home, but the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 only made it harder. George's work as a taxi driver dried up, and Annie's business of baking bread for the neighbors stalled. As a national lockdown took hold, it became even more difficult to pay rent on their apartment. We have to struggle every day of our life in Armenia, relying on the support of others, hoping for a better future for ourselves and our children, said Annie. We can hardly pay the bills, she said. Once the Syrian civil war began in 2011, families have suffered under brutal conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, torn the nation apart, and set back the standard of living by decades. After a decade of civil war, the Syrian war caused the largest refugee and displacement crisis of our time. About 5.6 million Syrians became refugees, and another 6.2 million people were displaced within Syria. Nearly 12 million people in Syria needed humanitarian assistance. At least half of the people affected by the Syrian refugee crisis were children. As of mid-year 2020, the number of refugees worldwide was estimated at 26 million. We are now witnessing a record high number of refugees and asylum seekers due to conflict, war, persecution, and human rights violation. Interestingly, the Bible also has much to say about this current global crisis. To migrate is to move. One of the most powerful experiences of migration in the Bible is the Exodus story. Throughout this second book of the Bible, God is portrayed as a migrant sojourning with the Hebrews. The book portrays two main refugee accounts. First, the story of Moses fleeing from Pharaoh and seeking sanctuary in the land of Media. And second, the story of Hebrews seeking refuge in the wilderness from the oppressive power of Egypt. Moses' plight and Israel's escape are commonly perceived as stories of refugees and seeking asylum. The opening verses of Exodus reveal that all the descendants of Jacob, including Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, have now settled in Egypt for a while. They have done well in the foreign land and they have become very numerous. But the situation is quickly changing. An ominous note of oppression and enslavement is about to happen because a new king who knew nothing of Joseph came to power. The king was afraid of the growth and the might of the Israelites. Furthermore, he feared that the Israelites might join forces with his enemies and therefore attacked Egypt. The king was rather paranoid. To curb the population growth, Pharaoh began to oppress the Israelites by forcing them into hard physical labor. Their primary tasks were to make bricks for Pharaoh's building projects and to do other menial forms of hard work. Like many migrant workers today, the Israelites were performing the 3D jobs: dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. Even worse, the Israelites had become Pharaoh's slaves. Yet, the more Pharaoh oppressed them, the more they multiply and spread. So paranoid was Pharaoh that he ordered newborn Hebrew boys to be killed by the midwives doing their deliveries. In the midst of this refugee crisis, God called Moses and commissioned him to return to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and liberate the Israelites from Egypt. What the Lord said to Moses is quite powerful and touching, especially for those who are immigrants and refugees. I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. God not only knows the misery of those who suffer, but actually feels their pains and hears their cry for mercy and justice. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and so he refused to let God's people go. The Israelites were permitted to leave only after numerous calamitous plagues, climaxing with the death of the eldest sons of the Egyptians, including Pharaoh's own son. For 40 years, the Israelites became landless and refugees wandering about in the desert. Their experience as refugees was harsh and was indelibly impressed in their collective memory. For example, in Deuteronomy 26, or Psalms 105, or Micah 6 verse 4 talks about this memory, collective memory. It is therefore not surprising that laws regarding immigrants figure so prominently in the Torah. The reason for Israel's giving special consideration to the plight of strangers, migrants, and refugees in a foreign land is rooted in Israel's own experience of mistreatment in Egypt. Along with many other law codes, Israel was commanded to take special care of the sojourners in their midst. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And you shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. There is an obvious parallel between the lives of Moses and Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. Many scholars have noted that Matthew specifically portrays Jesus as the new Moses. The 5 discourses of Jesus in Matthew correspond with the 5 books of the Torah. But perhaps the most noted parallelism is found in the infancy narrative of chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. Right after Jesus' birth, Matthew recounts the dramatic exodus of the Holy Family, escaping the wrath of King Herod, who felt threatened by the news of the birth of a new king in Bethlehem. The story of Jesus, Joseph, and Mary seeking refuge in Egypt obviously reinforces the underlying theme of the Moses-Jesus similarity. Joseph obeyed an angel's command in a dream, took the child and his mother by night, and swiftly fled to Egypt for refuge. Consequently, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph became asylum seekers. Without travel documents, they crossed borders looking for safety and sanctuary. Like many immigrants before and after them, Jesus and his family were political refugees, seeking asylum in a country that would open the doors for them. Egypt was the traditional place of refuge for many Israelites in biblical times. It seems that the thrust of the movement of Matthew chapter 2 is to have Jesus as Son of God go into Egypt in order to come out of Egypt, which clearly alludes to Israel's exodus and liberation. Similar to the Israelites in the Old Testament who were sojourners like Abraham and Sarah, or immigrants and refugees like Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Jeremiah, Israel in Assyria, and Judah in Babylon, and the returnees from exile. Jesus, who is the Son of God and Messiah, also became a victim of similar experiences, namely, threatened by an evil king, driven into exile, estranged from his own country, and returned to his birthplace in Bethlehem of Judea, only to be displaced again to Nazareth in Galilee. Jewish readers would definitely hear Old Testament echoes and allusions in this infancy narrative. Another literary indication of the Exodus motif is the fulfillment formula of Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, found in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I have called my son. By quoting Hosea, Matthew provides a scriptural basis for and prophecy fulfillment of the Messiah's exile and return. Jesus, who is declared the Son of God, is in a foreign territory, experienced persecution, alienation, and estrangement like many prophets of old and throughout Israel's salvation history. The child Messiah was displaced and dependent upon people's hospitality. He certainly knows what it was really like to be an immigrant and a refugee. Likewise, the adult Jesus, who will wander about here and there, preaching the good news, also has no place to lay his head. The Son of God, whose deathbed will be the beams of a cross, yet who will become the Messiah for all, is completely in solidarity with those who are estranged, despised, and ostracized, and promised to be with them until the end of the age. While Jesus was able to return to Israel, his homeland, most refugees do not have that recourse. Refugees are individuals who typically flee their home and country to escape severe religious or political persecution or other factors that violate their human rights. They run away to avoid harm due to them and their family. Thus, they flee to another country to apply for asylum or international protection. Their departure or escape usually means that they have reached a point of no return. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, around 1 million people seek asylum every year. While everyone has a right to seek asylum from persecution, it is not always possible to determine who qualifies for international protection in order to be granted asylum. During mass movements of refugees, the process becomes more difficult because the requests are too many and the demands too great. These groups of folks who are in a state of limbo are often called prima facie, meaning at first sight. They are prima facie refugees. For example, at the end of 2019, there were approximately 4.2 million people around the world waiting for a decision on their asylum claims. Several modern examples come to mind in Asia and Latin America. Mohammed, a Rohingya refugee who fled to Bangladesh with his family of 7, including a baby born along the way, said with tears streaming down his face, "They burn our house and drove us out by shooting. We walked for 3 days through the jungle. Approximately 671,000 Rohingya refugees have fled violence and serious human rights violations in Myanmar since August 2017. Many walked for days through the forest to reach safety in Bangladesh, including pregnant women, young children, the sick, and the elderly. Refugees have spontaneously settled in and around existing refugee communities in 2 main settlements, Kutupalong and Nayapaya, overstretching already limited services and scarce resources. The Kutupalong refugee settlement has grown to become the largest of its kind in the world, with more than 600,000 people living in an area of just 13 square kilometers, stretching infrastructure and services to their limits. After decades of conflict and war in Iraq, millions have been forced to abandon their homes. Many continue to flee with just their clothes on their backs and are in desperate need of emergency aid. Ongoing violence, insecurity, political threats, as well as lack of food, medicine, and essential services in Venezuela have compelled countless people, many of whom are women and children, to find shelter and food in neighboring countries. Many arrive scared, tired, and in dire need of basic assistance. This is the largest exodus in the region's history. As of mid-2020, there were over 650,000 asylum seekers from Venezuela worldwide. How can you help? There are many organizations that work around the clock to protect and assist refugees all over the world. One outstanding agency that draws upon a rich tradition of scripture and Catholic social teaching is Catholic Relief Services. CRS is known to assist countless refugees and vulnerable migrants around the world. You can check out their website, crs.org, or learn about their mission statement and how to get involved. Another important way is to raise awareness. First, however, one must keep up to date with the latest news and stories of refugees around the globe. One helpful website is the UNHR.org. The latest news release and stories are tremendously useful. Another way you can help is to pray regularly for refugees and asylum seekers. The UN has designated June 20th as World Refugee Day every year to honor refugees around the globe. Organizing a day of prayer on June 20th is a very good way to seek strength and courage for people who have been forced to flee their home country to escape conflict or persecution. Celebrating World Refugee Day is an occasion to build empathy and understanding for their plight and to recognize their resilience in rebuilding their lives. Every action counts. Never underestimate the power of the mustard seed. Even the smallest gesture of kindness can make an impact. Everyone, no matter how insignificant, has the power to make a difference.